There we go. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you to Johanna, Zawadi, Francisco, and Tim for bringing us together like this, and for all the hard work that has gone into the last 2 days. And thank you for the huge honor of delivering this keynote. So revisiting classic and influential texts is very important. Not something I think that urban scholars tend to do very often. Conferences are full of author meets the critics events, but we don't often get a collective opportunity to re-examine great books and consider them a quarter of a century on. I certainly feel quite profound sadness that the author of this particular book cannot be present at this conference, but maybe not present is the wrong way to put it. Since Neil passed away in 2012, on numerous occasions, he has remained a very strong presence among scholars who care about and fight for the things that mattered to Neil throughout his life. And this is one such occasion. The spirit of his work has been captured very faithfully over the past 2 days. So I want to express my thanks to the previous speakers, and moreover, my admiration for the remarkable work that you're doing. I think Neil would have been rather bemused by any celebration of his own work, but I'm certain, absolutely certain, that he would have been politically energized by what we have heard over 2 days. I'm going to be honest here. So before I received this invitation to speak, I had not read The New Urban Frontier all the way through, from cover to cover, since the year it was published. I dipped into it countless times, and I'd often immersed myself in key moments in the text, especially to prepare and update teaching materials, but I had not seriously engaged with the book as a whole since 1996. That year, I was a second-year undergraduate, gradually having a geographical awakening, I think you could best call it, not least because of the high drama of living in gentrifying East London. This was a different universe from a hitherto rather rural childhood, East London. I wanted to make sense of what I was learning about as a student and seeing in East London every day. So I borrowed a copy of The New Urban Frontier from the library at the university. I sat down to read it in my overpriced student accommodation. And I think the only way I can describe this was an existentially exhilarating experience. I loved the warmth of the preface, where we find out about a young man's first encounter with gentrification in Edinburgh and Philadelphia. And then, boom, a blistering opening chapter on class struggle in the Lower East Side. Just a glorious blend of intense and vivid description and astute political commentary, sharp and reasoned analysis, and above all, really above all, just searing passion. I'd been to Tompkins Square Park and Alphabet City in 1994, 2 years earlier, and I'd noticed different worlds colliding on that short visit, but I didn't know how to make sense of them. So 2 years later, Neil Smith's strong pen stepped in, and my goodness, it was exciting. I remember getting up from my seat as I was reading and walking around the room as I carried on reading. That's what I got from this book the first time I read it. I loved the visceral elegance of the prose and admired the synthesis of all kinds of evidence. And there was a conviction to the argument that leapt off every page, a seething anger at what was happening to the poorest residents of the city where the author lived and which he plainly loved, but anger that never descended into rant. Here was a serious scholar who cut through real estate and developer and politician bullshit with nerve and verve, and who guided me through subject matter that I wanted and needed to understand. I didn't know much about class struggle at the time, didn't know much about cities, didn't know much about politics, but I was like, wow, where do I sign up? Like, how do I do this kind of work? In my final year of undergraduate studies in London, my housemates and I got evicted by our landlord, who sold the house we lived in for almost triple what he paid for it 5 years before, and then gave us 30 days to get out. And so I was like, okay, I get what's happening here, thanks to Neil Smith. Then I did PhD research in Toronto and New York City, and I always held Neil's approach close to me. it seemed that it was impossible to be a gentrification researcher without throwing myself into tenant movements, throwing myself into housing justice struggles. Neil's example was to be close to people while analysing what was happening to them, learning from them, and ultimately walking in solidarity with them as they fought back. So when I reread the book from cover to cover to prepare for this conference, I was just blown away all over again by the relevance, by how fresh and by how captivating the writing came across 25 years on. Neil once said that you could make an awful lot of money betting on the incompetence of the ruling class, but the apparatus of repression propping them up is very well organized. And this seems to be precisely what is happening in Britain right now, after 11 years of conservative rule and so many of our public institutions being systematically dismantled via privatization and financialization that even Margaret Thatcher could hardly dream of. Revanchism was absolutely behind the project of austerity that we are still experiencing. This unbelievable headline from BBC News in 2010 being one of the low points. Revanchism was also absolutely behind the divide and rule project of Brexit, where the universal ambition to terrify the populace, as Neil put it, worked wonders in getting even working class people to think that their immigrant neighbours have stolen society from them and that they can take back control if they vote to tighten up our borders and break away from a mutually beneficial set of trade and legal arrangements with our closest neighbours in the EU. I hope I won't bore anyone with too many personal anecdotes today, and if that turns out to be the case, then I apologize. But as we've all had the important job of engaging and thinking with Neil, I want to share a few things with you, a few stories that shaped Neil's worldview and that lurked behind his scholarship. First of all, something Neil told me on our first meeting in Glasgow in 2002, first time I ever met Neil, at a conference on gentrification around the time I was finishing my PhD. At that conference, there were all kinds of analytical and political fault lines emerging. There were more than a few British scholars who were enamored with the then Labour government's urban regeneration policies and who had spent so much time drinking lattes with the middle classes that they were even starting to speak about positive gentrification. I remember Neil was just totally bemused and actually quite horrified at some of the things he was listening to. In fact, the early material for a piece I wrote on the eviction of critical perspectives from gentrification research was harvested from that conference in Glasgow. Anyway, my friend Winifred Curran kindly introduced me to Neil on the first evening of the conference. I was quite nervous about meeting him, but a few minutes into the conversation, the nerves went completely because of his immense warmth and his unassuming nature. We also bonded over having the same colour hair, although I think he was disappointed that I wasn't Scottish. I probably had 1,000 questions for him, so I asked him if there were any moments or any events in particular that led him to come up with the concept of the revanchist city. I wanted to ask him 1,000 things, but that was what I asked him. Was there anything in particular that led you to come up with this concept? And in response, he elaborated on something briefly mentioned in the book, and it was very sobering. At the end of the opening chapter, that marvelous opening chapter I described earlier, there's like a Tchaikovsky-like crescendo as he explores the new social geography of the city in terms of frontier violence. And he briefly mentions the gruesome 1989 murder of Bruce Bailey, a tenant activist in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, whose dismembered body was found in garbage bags on a sidewalk in the South Bronx. That evening in Glasgow, Neil told me a bit about Bruce Bailey. He knew him fairly well, and they had once spent an evening arguing and eventually agreeing that Friedrich Engels was far more helpful in understanding gentrification in New York City than anyone else. Bruce Bailey had made many people angry, especially landlords. The founder and president of the Columbia Tenants Union, he was known for being the most confrontational of all the tenant organizers in the city, quick to organize a rent strike, quick to find any way possible to shame and humiliate landlords. And his in-your-face tactics were questioned even by other tenant organizers. But most who knew Bruce Bailey agreed. A landlord had to be behind his murder. But the case was never solved, and nobody was ever charged. What puzzled Neil was that Bailey had been pissing people off for well over 20 years. So why then did someone decide to kill him? And why so brutally? What was it about that historical moment in New York City that set the conditions for his appalling murder? To Neil, who killed Bruce Bailey, didn't just want him to go away. They wanted him to be found like that as a warning statement of intent. And there was a reason the murder mystery was never solved. Bailey made no friends among the powerful, obviously, as an irritating tenant organizer. New York City was trying to recover from economic malaise, and its prognosis was uncertain. Bailey was quite simply a thorn in the backside of the real estate industry that was encouraged by the state to lead the economic recovery. Bailey was seen as somebody who'd organized working class people to steal the city and from whom elites wanted it back. So the concept of the revanchist city was Neil's way of analyzing what was happening. As he says on page 29, and I quote, "It is difficult to be optimistic that the next wave of gentrification will bring a new urban order more civilized than the first." Just as an aside, many years later, Neil told me of another moment behind the concept of revanchism. In 1994, he was sharing a taxi with another very distinguished urban scholar attending the AAG conference in San Francisco. The car in front of the taxi stopped at some lights, and squeegee cleaners descended upon that car, and arguments about payment delayed its progress, and the taxi and the cars behind for some time. There was a long delay. And this incident triggered a massive rant from Neil's taxi companion about the blight of homeless people in American cities, the scourge of aggressive begging, the need to clean up the streets and take the city back for civilized people. Neil said he was far too shocked to reply coherently, but he immediately thought of the revanchists of 19th century Paris and felt like he was sharing a taxi with one of them. Anyway, back to our first meeting in Glasgow. So Neil spoke with poignant eloquence about what New York City had become, about the tenant movements with which he had genuine connections, and the structural roots of revenge against the poor and how they connected to rent gaps and uneven development. It was captivating. But what impressed me most on our first meeting was that Neil was only interested in the gentrification debates if they could get us somewhere politically. Many years later, I came across this quote from Pierre Bourdieu, and I think it sums up well how Neil thought about the gentrification debates. Certainly at the time he was writing this book anyway. He was much more interested in what scholars could contribute politically alongside tenant movements and struggles for housing justice. So what I'm going to do for the next half hour or so is to consider what we can still learn from Neil's book and Neil's approach to gentrification theoretically, empirically, and especially politically. A quarter of a century has passed since the book was published, and in that time, a massive amount of gentrification scholarship has emerged from all over the world. And some of this work draws upon and extends Neil's arguments, and some of it takes issue with what he said. Now, for obvious reasons, I can't go into all this work. We'd be here for the rest of the year if I did. What I can do is provide a few snapshots of some important things that I think we can learn from Neil today, and also from those who think with Neil, and also from those who have challenged Neil. So I've got a book coming out, which Tim very kindly mentioned this September, published by the University of California Press. There's the cover. To cut a long story short, this book is a critical analysis of the concepts and categories and methods of mainstream urban studies. In mainstream urban studies, intellectual inquiry is typically atheoretical and guided primarily by the priorities of state managers, business elites, and the worries of the mainstream media, so that the structural and institutional conditions generating inequalities go unquestioned and accepted. So in writing this book, I set myself a question. I thought it was a simple question when I set it for myself, but it turned out to be far from it. How are the mechanisms behind urban inequalities, material deprivation, marginality, and social suffering perpetuated and made invisible? So I like to see my book as an attempt to expose the rise and spread of what I think we might call a vested interest urbanism. and also an attempt to critique the subservience of quite a lot of urban research to the concerns, categories, and moods of policy and opinion makers. Throughout my book, I deploy the concept of agnotology in order to analyze vested interest urbanism. Very briefly, what is this agnotology? What am I talking about here? Well, scholarship has traditionally and justifiably been concerned with epistemology, the production of knowledge. But we live in a world where people elected to the highest positions of public office routinely lie, and become even more popular the more that they lie. So it seems necessary, I think, in the world that we live in, to shift questions away from what people know about the society in which they live towards questions about what people do not know and why not. And these questions require a rejection of appeals to epistemology and instead a focus on intentional ignorance production. That's what agnotology is. The term was coined by the historian of science, Robert Proctor, and refers to the intentional production of ignorance. And it was while investigating the tobacco industry's efforts to manufacture doubt about the health hazards of smoking that Robert Proctor began to see the scientific and political urgency in researching how ignorance is made, maintained, and manipulated by powerful institutions to suit their own agendas. And as he discovered, the industry went to great lengths to give the impression that the cancer risks of smoking was still an open question, even when the clinical evidence was overwhelming. Key techniques of those producing ignorance, among many, include the concoction of a falsely balanced debate in which there should always be two sides to every story, and pumping excess noise into the public discussion as a ubiquity helps pave the way for inevitability. It's just two examples of how agnotology is done. So for my book, I wanted to see what I could do by applying agnotology to the study of urban inequality. Chapter 3 of my book is called Gentrification Beyond False Choice Urbanism. And I use Neil's theorizations to respond to the mainstream view that gentrification is to be welcomed because it has to be better than the supposed alternative of urban decline. Here's some great writing, I think, by James DePhilippis that explains this false choice, I think, better than I can. So I'm just going to read through it because I think it's lovely writing, and I think it's really important to get to grips with what this is, because I've heard false choice urbanism being critiqued in numerous presentations. And I think what James does here is put this all together to tell us what we're dealing with. So he says, since the emergence of gentrification, it has become untenable to argue that reinvestment is a desirable end in and of itself for low-income people and residents of disinfested areas. Instead, rightfully conceived, reinvestment needs to be understood through the lens of questions such as, what kind of investment? For whom? Controlled by whom? These processes have left residents of low-income neighborhoods in a situation where, since they exert little control over either investment capital or their homes, they are facing the choices of either continued disinvestment and decline in the quality of the homes they live in, or reinvestment that results in their displacement. So, summarized in one sentence, potential displacement or prolonged disinvestment is not much of a choice for people struggling to make a life in cities. But false choice urbanism seems to be everywhere. I have lost count of the number of high-profile statements on gentrification in the last 2 decades that have succumbed to, I think, a tired, exhausted formula. They weigh up the supposed pros and cons of gentrification, often amid tedious attempts at levity, and they throw in a few half-baked concerns about threats to diversity and housing affordability, and then conclude that gentrification is actually good on balance because it represents reinvestment that somehow stops neighborhoods from dying and gives people opportunities to improve their lives. I want to share with you one brief example of how quickly false choice urbanism circulates. In 2019, there was a very well publicized working paper by economists Quentin Brummett and Davin Reed, sponsored by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. There's some vested interest urbanism for you. Briefly, these authors used longitudinal microdata from the US Census to study the effects of gentrification on the educational achievement and household status of original residents, which were very loosely defined, of low-income central city neighborhoods in the 100 largest metropolitan areas of the United States. The authors interpreted the data to argue these things. Many original residents, including the most disadvantaged, are able to remain in gentrifying neighborhoods and share in any neighborhood improvements, and that low-income neighborhoods that gentrify appear to improve along a number of dimensions known to be correlated with opportunity. And they subsequently concluded that concerns about the displacement of low-income people because of gentrification are exaggerated and overblown. Perhaps most striking was that this study completely and conveniently ignored a substantial international literature on the trauma of displacement experienced by people kicked out of their homes, either from gentrifying neighborhoods or even within them. And the agnotology at work is clear in the author's claim that understanding how gentrification actually occurs and whether it harms or benefits original residents is something on which there is little apparently comprehensive evidence. This is just complete nonsense. Precisely the kind of injection of doubt where there is little doubt that feeds right-wing commentators on the prowl for any kind of academic sound bites to support their belief that gentrification is the desirable and only conceivable remedy for concentrated poverty. It was hardly a surprise that the Financial Times reported the study under the heading "Gentrification Benefits Local Residents, Research Finds." Philadelphia Inquirer said this: effects of gentrification on long-time residents are not as negative as typically perceived. City Lab, the hidden winners in neighborhood gentrification. And City Journal, gentrification for social justice. And in fact, that's just 4 of probably at least 50 media immediate responses to this article in the mainstream media. So Neil Smith's huge body of work on gentrification is crucial in responding to this because it situates gentrification in a much sturdier analytical register. What it does is that it blasts open this tenacious and constrictive dualism of reinvestment or disinvestment. Neil shows how the two are fundamentally intertwined in a wider process of capitalist urbanization and uneven development that creates profit and class privilege for some while stripping many of the human need of shelter. So reinvestment and disinvestment do not represent some sort of moral conundrum, with the former somehow on balance being better than the latter. Nor does reinvestment represent some sort of magical remedy for those who have lived through and endured decades of disinvestment. So gentrification and decline are not opposites, they're not alternatives, they're not choices, but rather they are tensions and contradictions in the overall system of capital circulation. So Neil urges us to consider who and what makes urban land profitable for reinvestment, and by doing so, questions such as urbanism for whom, urbanism against whom, and who decides come to the forefront. And false choice urbanism can then be exposed for what it is, which is basically a red herring. Another hallmark of false choice urbanism is the avoidance of the language of class when talking about gentrification. And that brings me to the question of definition, which has been quite a theme I've heard over the last 2 days. So for almost as long as gentrification has been studied, there has been disagreement over how to define it. In short, whether it should refer only to the residential rehabilitation first described by Ruth Glass in London in 1964, or to a much larger scale production of urban space for the middle classes, involving new build developments on vacant land, for example. There are many scholars who worry about the stretching of the term, and there are many scholars who insist that we go no further than the fine details of what Ruth Glass wrote about in 1964, because then the term loses its meaning. That's the argument made. More recently, there are those who argue that the term gentrification has little or no meaning and no relevance beyond the global north. More on those critiques in a minute. Back in 1986, Neil Smith and Peter Williams wrote this in the introduction to the edited collection, Gentrification of the City. If we look back at the attempted definitions of gentrification, it should be clear that we are concerned with a process much broader than merely residential rehabilitation, which is only one facet of a more profound economic, social, and spatial restructuring. a highly dynamic process. It is not amenable to overly restrictive definitions. So, although in his very early writings, Neil talks about gentrification only as the rehabilitation of buildings. So his earliest pieces of work, he stuck with the Ruth Glass definition. From 1986 onwards, 10 years before the New Urban Frontier, he was adamant that gentrification is something much broader. So rereading the New Urban Frontier, I thought, well, what is gentrification viewed through Neil Smith's analytical lenses? And this is, I think, what I found in the book when I read it 25 years on all the way through. A class-based restructuring and remaking of urban space, a class retaking and reconquest of the city, and a set of social claims over who does and who does not deserve to live in the city. One thing I think has become very clear in the last 2 days is that these lenses are insufficient. I'll move on to this in a moment, but Neil always insisted on the primacy of class, and that if you were talking about gentrification without talking about class, you were doing it wrong. I think I remember Neil saying that to me at one point. I also remember him saying, with reference to Harlem, which he wrote about in the book, that Black landlords evicting Black tenants shows us that class struggle is what we should be worrying about the most. And I know he had many difficult and unresolved arguments with tenant organizers in Harlem about that issue. In the New Urban Frontier, he does mention class and race together when talking about gentrification, especially in Harlem, but he never goes into any serious conceptual depth. That's already been pointed out by other speakers. I'd argue that in urban studies, we've become a lot better at dealing with the intersection of class, race, and space since 1996. And we've seen that in abundance over the last 2 days. And previous speakers actually do a much better job than I think I can on these issues. So while gentrification always involves class transformation, it is very often about much more than that. Take, for instance, a 2018 definition provided by Causa Justa Just Cause, an organization based in the Bay Area of California, working for better housing for marginalized people. I love this definition. If you can find me a better one, I want to see it. I think this is just magnificent. A profit-driven racial and class reconfiguration of urban working class communities of color that have suffered from a history of disinvestment and abandonment. Right. When I came across that, I was like, right, that's going in like lecture 1 to gentrification to my students. And there are hundreds of examples in the academic literature on gentrification as a process of class and racial reconfiguration. And we've seen a lot of these since the New Urban Frontier was published. One remarkable contribution to this literature, which I've been looking forward to highlighting because I just thought it was tremendous, has been provided by the anthropologist Ida Danavid, who analysed London's 2017 Grenfell Tower disaster as part of a much wider global city cartography of imperial and racial violence. Drawing on the literature on racial capitalism, she argued that racial inequality is not simply an effect of discriminatory landlords, lenders, and employers, but rather a constituent logic of capital. More revealingly, she went further than Neil Smith by reminding us that modern forms of urban planning, such as segregation, slum administration, slum clearance, these were first experimented with in colonial and settler cities before they were implemented back in the imperial metropoles. And this practice has simply continued in the colonizing ethos of contemporary housing, regeneration, and renewal schemes in cities like London. So for Danavid, gentrification, and I use her words here, takes place through the creation of raced space. And then she goes on to say it's less about a new urban colonialism, as it's often called. I think there was a book edited collection with that title. And so it's less about that than about the continuation of the old one. The importance of understanding gentrification as something more than only a class-based process can also be seen in the recent literature on the relationship between gender and gentrification, which is not something that's come up in the last 2 days as much as I thought it would. Winifred Curran has demonstrated this in this marvelous book when a majority of public sector workers, public housing residents, and the social services dependent elderly are female, the impact of gentrification disproportionately threatens women's social commitments, livelihoods, and place attachments. So it's no coincidence that some of the most effective anti-gentrification struggles have been led by and fought by women. And evictions also disproportionately affect working class women of colour, which of course points to the importance of intersectional approaches that examine how various axes of difference cut across each other and are expressed and negotiated through the process of gentrification. And Maya's wonderful presentation earlier was, I think, an exemplar of how to do this kind of work. So where am I going with this? I'm pointing out that while class transformation is happening wherever there is gentrification, the process is by no means reducible to just one dimension of social differentiation. And what we've heard over the last 2 really exciting days of scholarship confirms this. However, and this is crucial, Neil Smith's insistence on the primacy of class doesn't mean that he's irrelevant. This is because dimensions of social differentiation are crucial to the devalorization and revalorization of urban land, which is of course something that Neil helped us understand so deeply. That brings me to the rent gap theory now. I could talk for days about it, but I won't because we're all tired, but I'll say a few things about the rent gap theory. In June 2019, there was a day of sessions at the Nordic Geographers meeting in Trondheim in Norway, exploring 40 years of rent gap theory. After a riveting day of really interesting papers from all over the world, the urban geographer Phil Hubbard obviously wasn't so impressed with what he listened to. And this is what he said. The rent gap at 40 session today suggested the concept still has legs. My prediction, by 50, it will be like me, dodging knees and increasingly irrelevant. So that was Phil Hubbard's view of that day of papers. In one sense, I hope he's right, because that would mean that in 2029, capitalism will have dodgy knees and will be increasingly irrelevant. And I know that Neil Smith would have hoped that he was right. But the rent gap theory is basically a theory of how the state provides the conditions for interest-bearing capital to circulate through urban land markets. Neil had a passionate conviction that we must think more historically, more geographically than what he called the empiricist and ecological quagmire of neoclassical economics. By thinking this way, we can begin to understand precisely how, when, and where space is being produced and in whose interests. What I got from rereading The New Urban Frontier 25 years on was an even stronger sense that Neil brought an historical spatiality to understanding gentrification. A few speakers have picked up on this. Neil was a wonderful historical geographer, and I think you see that I noticed that more in the book when I reread it. For example, on page 144, when discussing Harlem, he says, and I quote, "We should be more inclined to see the general process of gentrification as trenchant and long-term. If it were temporary and small scale, why would developers and incoming residents make such long-term investments here rather than in neighborhoods perceived as socially and economically less risky?" So with the rent gap theory, Neil's PhD advisor, David Harvey, felt that his student was just rehashing Homer Hoyt's 1930s work on the urban land market in Chicago and missing a load of important theoretical work on land rent. At the time, David Harvey was hard at work writing Limits to Capital. And David Harvey actually told me this. He was really pissed off that this young Scottish troublemaker wasn't reading enough. And he told Neil that nobody would ever take any notice of the rent gap theory because it was much too simple and definitely obvious. I'd argue that David Harvey missed the fact that Neil wanted to make an intervention that looked historically and spatially to make a contribution politically. And I always point out to my students that Neil mischievously placed his paper in a collection of articles in the Journal of the American Planning Association celebrating neighborhood revitalization, a term that made Neil wince. In 2009, Neil took me to the site where he first saw gentrification in 1972, which was a new pub on Rose Street in Edinburgh that distinguished itself from most other pubs in Scotland by serving quite appetizing lunches adorned with salad. As we walked and talked, we discussed the rent gap debates, and he told me that he was really frustrated that so many scholars had missed the politics of the theory and were instead complaining about what the theory lacked, or were squabbling pedantically about whether it could be empirically verified. So, to be sure, the rent gap theory has been subject to very constructive and progressive critique in scholarship that recognizes its politics. But when you read the literature as a whole, it's hard to avoid the sense that most of the critiques are actually quite pointed attacks. For 3 decades, it's a long time to deal with criticism, but for 3 decades, it got attacked as structuralist, determinist, essentialist, a lack of middle-class agency at the heart of it, simplistic, one-sided, ideological. That was always one of the ones that annoyed me, by people say it was ideological, as if other things aren't. Hard to test or prove empirically, no predictive power, and fatally flawed. Neil's responses to the noisier critiques of this time are revealing, and this particular one was to Stephen Barassa, and you can detect, I think, in his reply, the frustration that I mentioned that he told me about when we went to the site where he first spotted gentrification. For the last decade, mostly since Neil passed away, the rent gap theory has been attacked by scholars working with post-colonial theory as economistic, an imperialist meta-narrative, a form of epistemic violence. I've seen it be critiqued as irrelevant in the global south. I've seen it critiqued as masculinist, as something that cannot explain state strategies or extra economic force. Now, some of these accusations seem ridiculous to me when you read any of his early papers on the key role of the state, which were developed from this undergraduate dissertation that he wrote carrying the subtitle State Involvement in Society Hill. Also, the accusations of imperialist reasoning aimed at Neil seem equally ridiculous if you read The New Urban Frontier, where his expose of the colonialist rhetoric of urban pioneers and the parallels with Frederick Jackson Turner's settler colonial frontier violence seem to resonate with a lot of today's post-colonial urban theory. In my book, I go into some depth about the rent gap theory, and I explore all of these critiques, past and present, and I try and clear up some of the confusion and I think some of the noise around the theory. And this is what I say about the rent gap theory. I won't go into each of these because I haven't got time, but that final one there, the rent gap theory can help explain gentrification beyond the north. I'm sure that a lot of people who work in the global south and people who work with post-colonial theory would take issue with that. But my argument here is that although it's very important to ask theoretical questions about the pertinence of certain concepts and whether they are helpful or not in dissecting urban processes beyond where they were formed, the fact that the rent gap theory was developed from research in the United States in the 1970s is not by itself a valid reason to dismiss it elsewhere, ignore it, or indeed unlearn it 4 decades later. So concepts are explanatory devices. They are there to be useful to us if we need them. They are there to bring things to light that we did not see before or know about, or they are there to help explain phenomena that require careful scrutiny. They may or may not have utility across geographical and historical contexts, but if they help explain social phenomena and help us answer questions we have asked ourselves, then they should be retained. By the same token, if they turn out not to be helpful, then we shouldn't use them, especially as there could be more powerful concepts within different contexts that we may not have considered that could actually be even more helpful than the rent gap theory. But just because it was developed in Philadelphia in the 1970s doesn't automatically mean that it's completely invalid anywhere else. And I've seen people make that argument. The same applies to the concept of the revanchist city. I took some time last week to search through articles and books published since 1996 that explore revanchism in action. Not only are there many studies in what we might consider the revanchist heartlands of North America and Western Europe and Australia, but I found detailed studies of urban revanchism in the following countries. And forgive me for this list, but I think it's important to read them out. So this is where people have observed, documented, and analyzed revanchism in action: Mexico, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Jamaica, Morocco, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Egypt, Lebanon, Greece, Hungary, Ukraine, United Arab Emirates, India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, and South Korea. So it's not difficult to see why Neil wrote a piece in 2009 called Revanchist Planet, which Hamish mentioned earlier today. In mentioning all this, I'm not embarking, I hope, on some kind of totalizing meta-narrative, and I don't think Neil was either. But what I'm doing is pointing to the fact that there's a lot of policy learning going on across contexts as states try and deal with the inevitable fallout of decades of deregulation and privatization and welfare retrenchment, and as they sweep the urban poor out of sight at precisely the same time as they embrace the financialization of land and real estate. One of the things I have noticed about the critiques of Neil's work is that they have come way more from the left than the right. You wouldn't think that if Neil's a Marxist, you'd think he'd be a prime target for people on the right, but it's actually the left who have gone after Neil's writings more. And that's still the case today. There does seem to be a tendency to a kind of leftist sectarianism sometimes in urban studies between, on the one hand, those who work with Marxist political economy to understand things like scalar transformations, violence and injustice vis-a-vis the mutations of contemporary capitalist exploitation. And on the other hand, those who work with, say, feminist, queer, post-colonial approaches to urban questions and look at urban manifestations of racism and nationalism and coloniality and patriarchy and heteronormativity and so on. But I think some of these debates, not all, but some of them can so easily become narcissistic and totally disconnected from urban struggles. And professors endlessly criticizing each other about who has the better critical approach is really not a good look when working class people are being evicted and when the cost of housing is becoming completely ruinous and when women and people of color and indigenous people are disproportionately banished from public spaces and when there's just so much injustice to fight against. The other thing is that literatures that may not seem compatible often turn out to be even more instructive if you bring them together. In Barcelona in 2015, there was a big international conference exploring Neil Smith's work on gentrification. And 2 years later, this book was published featuring the papers. It's a wonderful book. Sadly, it's one of these overpriced Routledge books, but there's some great essays in this. In it, there's a striking chapter on the relationship between gentrification, displacement, and police violence against Black people in Ferguson, Missouri, written by Deb Cowan and Nimoy Lewis. And the authors argue that the rent gap in American cities should be understood as a profoundly racial and violent effect of internal colonialism. So what they do is that they demonstrate that Ferguson has become a majority Black suburb as a result of gentrification and displacement from St. Louis and surrounding areas, but that shift is not reflected in the political leadership or police force of Ferguson, which remains entirely white. So the outcome is that this leadership effectively functions as a brutal internal colonial administration. So what they did is they brought Marxist and post-colonial insights together in a profoundly instructive and I think politically progressive way. 6 years after Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, George Floyd was murdered outside an Arab American store on the corner of 38th and Chicago streets in the south side of Minneapolis, literally at the point where four neighborhoods meet. And these neighborhoods are Central, Bryant, Bancroft, and Powderhorn Park. Central and Bryant are historically poor African American neighborhoods. Bancroft and Powderhorn Park are historically middle-class white neighborhoods. This segregation is the outcome of a familiar story, racial covenants added by real estate developers in the first half of the 20th century that prevented the sale or lease of land to people of color, trapping African Americans in neighborhoods with no chance of living elsewhere in the city. Central and Bryant are now more mixed, with majority working class white and Latinx residents. Bancroft and Powderhorn Park have gentrified significantly in the last decade. According to a community organizer interviewed by a reporter for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Chicago was the divide, which is why 38th and Chicago has been battled over. It's where a historic white and a historic Black community meet. This is an old battle for land. It goes back 400 years on this continent. So George Floyd was murdered by police where very different worlds collide under racial capitalism, where city council members in recent years have been trying to encourage gentrification in the hope that the relative affluence of Bancroft and Powderhorn Park will cross Chicago Street. So the lesson here, the analytical and political lesson, is that understanding contemporary spaces of racial segregation and disinvestment as not only rent gaps, but as internal colonies, to draw on that analysis I just mentioned, seems necessary in the context of the revanchist dehumanization of Black lives and corresponding land dispossession. I'm going to conclude now. So in the spring of 2011, as a wave of urban uprisings was occurring in North Africa and the Middle East, Neil Smith gave a talk at the Japanese language school in the downtown east side of Vancouver, one of the global epicenters of anti-gentrification struggle. And I must thank my friend and collaborator, Elvin Wiley, who I believe is on the call for this photo and his account of the event. Neil's visit was coordinated by a group of artists who staged an exhibition, and Neil wrote an essay that was shown on posters that appeared around town before he arrived, and it was called Manifesto for a Poetry of the Future. In his essay, or in his talk at this community center, he said this, and I quote, "Urbanites, all who dwell in cities from Vancouver to Mumbai, Prince George to Prague, Boston Bar to Bogota, where will revolution begin? If a full life is now called utopianism or unrealistic, then let's hold on to it. Suddenly, the social and political future looks radically open. It is now time to end utopian anti-utopianism and jumpstart history again." In the years and months before he passed away, Neil was thinking very deeply about geography and revolution, world historical events such as the financial crash of 2008, the massive uprisings of 2011, culminating in the Occupy movement, made it impossible for Neil to ignore these links. But the revolutionary potential of geographical thought was always driving his theorizations, as far back as when he was an undergraduate, all the way through the new urban frontier and well beyond. He concluded his famous rent gap paper by imagining a scenario where, and I quote, "the needs of capital would be systematically dismantled to be displaced by the social, economic, and cultural needs of people as the principle according to which the restructuring of space occurs." Neil disliked the word policy intensely. He always argued that the only way to end gentrification was to abolish the capitalist mode of production under which policies are made. In particular, he took many cues from Friedrich Engels' pamphlet, The Housing Question, especially the fact that the housing problem is not simply a problem of workers being exploited as workers, it's workers being exploited as consumers of housing, and workers having no choice but to live on urban land that is subject to rampant speculation. As a practicing Marxist, Neil was interested in exposing how socially created use values of land get expropriated and then converted into exchange values. And we have to fight our way through that dialectical tension between use and exchange value in order to get somewhere. I'm going to finish by arguing that if we think more broadly about use values, then the future becomes even more radically open than I think Neil thought it was. We all know that there are large and interconnected literatures on the right to housing, the right to place, the right to the city, and these have given us profound insights on the tactics deployed by social movements in order to fight for a democratized and decommodified futures. But relatively few of these writings consider radically different understandings of land that can help rehumanize oppressed peoples against classism, racism, and sexism. So critical urban studies tends to identify the social sources of critique in the perspectives of such social movements and politicized workers, but there's an even wider world of alternative territorial perspectives from which we can derive insights about land, about urban inequalities, and how to address them. This is a great piece that appeared in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research a couple of years ago. And this is by Nama Blackman-Thomas and Libby Porter. And what they argue is that if we foreground Indigenous knowledges and struggles and think about radically different politically progressive understandings of land, then we can get somewhere, right, in terms of thinking about how use values and how we understand those can be expanded into a much broader thing to take on the might of exchange values. What these authors show is that land dispossession in settler societies where they work is especially painful for indigenous peoples, not only because of the violence of theft, but because land among indigenous peoples tends to be constituted in a totally different way from, say, European white possession. So it's regarded among many indigenous peoples, land, as the genesis of being. And I'll leave this writing up here for you to read as I talk. But what they are trying to demonstrate here is that indigenous ontologies have tremendous potential for reconsidering land and land struggles, not only in settler societies, but in any society where the exchange value of land and housing has been naturalized to the extent that it squashes any other consideration of land. If you're interested in this kind of work in the South African context, I recommend the writings of Tanya Winkler in Cape Town on these very issues. So indigenous epistemologies and philosophies for reading land, reading place and belonging and identity can inform a critical urban studies concerned with unsettling these hegemonic logics of commodification and marketization. And these knowledges, and this is my point I'm trying to make, is that they can be combined with Marxist work. They needn't be considered as incompatible. And fused together, we can understand much more about how use values are socially created, and also how broad use values could and should be. In a thunderous essay published not long before he passed away, Neil Smith was thinking about what a heist on capitalism, to use his words, might require, and that's what he said. So I think a challenge for critical urban studies is for the left to move beyond some of these sectarian battles I mentioned earlier about who has the more relevant approach, and fuse all kinds of knowledges together to the point where the combined insights can become the tools for organizing that Neil believed in so passionately. And then, as I said earlier, the future becomes perhaps even more radically open than Neil thought. So I'll stop there. Sorry I've overrun a bit, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Tom. You know, you gave a great account there of a sort of masterful interweaving of theory, deploying insights from personal anecdotes, I think, that were revealing, and then leaving us at the end with practical politics. So thank you very much. You know, I felt that the talk was full of the iconoclasm that sort of characterized Neil's work, and of course the radicalism. So it was a perfect conclusion to our panels today. So, but let's move. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and so I encourage people maybe to put questions in the chat, or to put raise their virtual hands, and you can ask the question directly if you like. I'll be monitoring it. So yeah, go ahead, have at it.
Or I could have exhausted everyone, and that's fine. Sorry.
No, I did see, right, yeah, we do have somebody. Derek, why don't you go ahead?
All right, Tom, that was wonderful, and I greatly admire your work. I've been following it for years and years and years, and this is the first time we're meeting, and we were doing it virtual as opposed to sitting down having a scotch together. I thought that's how it would go, but you know, we'll get to that eventually. But yeah, really enjoyed all the things that you said. So it made me think about what has transpired over the last 2 days and your thoughts on this. That you mentioned that Neil, you know, sees the greatest class or cleavage is a class divide. And even though he wrote about gender and he wrote about race and other social categories, that it always came back to class because he was a Marxist. But I'm wondering if he was here today and heard the discussions over the last 2 days, and just has seen the US context during the pandemic and, you know, George Floyd and the protests and everything that has transpired, do you think he would still come down on a class analysis as being central to understanding spatial land formations and cities within the US? I won't broaden it out past the US, but just focusing it on the US. Or,
oh, I mean, I wish I knew. I'm guessing that I think the analysis would have been modified. However, I think that the importance of class would have always been there. I think that he would certainly hang on to that thing he once said, which I mentioned earlier, where if you're doing gentrification research without thinking about class, you're doing it wrong. What I think the interesting question would be is, would he say that if you're doing gentrification research without race, are you doing it wrong? And I'm not sure that he would say that even now. However, I think that he would probably say that the key thing is intersectionality, right? Along the lines that we heard from Maya in that wonderful presentation earlier, right? I think we'd start thinking about different ways in which class, race, gender, sexuality, all, you know, and the relationships between those axes of difference, how that relates to how urban space is contested, right? So I think that he would certainly have done that. But I do think that, you know, if we take his entire enormous body of work at its word, then I think that class would always have been seen as the thing that we hang on to the most. But it's a difficult question to answer, Derek, because he's not here, right? And, you know, I think that, you know, there have been earth-shattering events since he passed away, and who knows how he would have responded to them. I do know that, for example, one of the absolute leading figures in the study of racial capitalism, Ruthie Gilmore, was his student. So, you know, I think that I am certain that he would have taken these very, very seriously. But I still think that class probably would have been where we start from and maybe where we finish.
I just have to ask one follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Where do you come down? And I can't wait to read The Shaking Up of the City, I guess coming out in September.
Yeah.
I don't know if you exactly drilled down on the question I just asked, what you thought, Neil, but where are you on that question?
I think where I am is that I think that it's impossible to talk about gentrification in most contexts I'm aware of without talking about class and race and gender. Right. And I think the moment we abandon any one of those, then I think we could well be doing it wrong. Right. So that's where I am at the moment. And I think I'm going more that direction. But I also think that there's I'm more and more excited by some of, mainly through various visits I've had to South Africa and learning from people like Tanya and listening to people like Libby Porter. And I'm starting to get interested in a different ways of thinking about the urban that come from settler colonial and decolonial theory. But I don't think these are incompatible with class analysis. So I'm excited about what kind of insights we can get when we put all this stuff together rather than see it as opposites. Thanks for the question, Derek. And we will have that drink one day.
Tom, I wonder if I could jump in with a quick question, which has to do with the role of ideology. You were saying at the end there, I think with a quote from Neil, that one of the tools, one of the weapons has to do with ideology, and also connecting this with this rethinking or thinking more expansively about use value. Wondering what, maybe if you could just elaborate a little bit on what are those ideological tools that we can be deploying in this struggle?
Well, I think the ideological tools come from marching alongside in solidarity with all these housing justice struggles, right? I'm excited by the fact that, you know, for the first time in my entire academic career, I'm finally seeing cross-national housing justice struggle kind of research get funded. right? And it's this kind of work which is aligned and absolutely working together and in collaboration with tenant movements, neighborhood councils, and all sorts of democratic forums in order for us to learn from the things that people are doing to mobilize around questions of not only what affordable housing tactics there could be, but also, what how differently we might think about land, and how land can be something which is much more than the way it's normally written about in sort of structural Marxist work, right? Not saying that that work is bad, but it has its limits, right? And so if we start thinking about the philosophical and epistemological insights that come from scholarship, and then learn more from people who are absolutely, on the front lines of fighting land dispossession and evictions, then I think that those are the tools that Neil's, I like to think the tools that he would probably say, this is where we're going if we want a heist on capitalism.
Thank you. Brandy Summers has a question.
I think you might have called on me, Tim. My connection is very unstable, but thank you so much, Tom, for this talk. I'm going to ask a selfish question because it's something I'm trying to figure out myself, but I really do appreciate you using Neil's work to critique urban studies and these ways that there are limits to understanding not only gentrification, but understanding the flows of capital and how it impacts various environments. But I want to go to, you were talking about revanchism, and what that constantly makes me think about is time and the temporal qualities of like thinking of it literally in terms of revenge. And so revenge seems to have a temporal concept, or at least component to it as well. So I'm wondering how much you think time has an impact on the effects of gentrification, especially in different locations. I want to jump on what Derek was saying about the United States context, because there's a way in which, we can look at various elements or parts of the mid 20th century and think about today, though there might be different stages of gentrification, we're still seeing a lot of the same things happen over and over again. And so there seems to be some cycle or cycling. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that. I don't know that I necessarily want you to think about what would Neil say, but more so, what do you say, Tom, especially as you're thinking about these very robust critiques of urban studies and kind of what they've been missing or perhaps ignoring for vested interests?
Yeah, thank you, Randy, for the question. As you were talking, I was just thinking of how much I got from Mindy Fuller-Love's work. And, most of the interviews that she did were from people who were displaced, if I remember correctly, from 3 cities on the East Coast, or no, hang on, it was one on the West Coast as well, wasn't it? From urban renewal schemes in the 60s, if I remember. I haven't read that book for a while, but that's my main memory of it. And alongside that, I remember there's a great book and a great study by Mark Freed, who worked at the Massachusetts General Hospital to survey people who were displaced by a freeway in Boston that plowed through a neighborhood. And the book was called The World of the Urban Working Class, and a paper that was very famous was called Grieving for a Lost Home. And in my own work in the past, when I've done that kind of research in terms of asking people, how did you feel when you were evicted, or how did you feel when you heard that this was going to happen? Grief is one of the things which comes up, right? And I think, and that was what, 50, 60 years on. And so, yeah, these things are cyclical, I think. So you've almost answered the question, and I agree with you. But where do we go with this? The problem with these kinds of analyses, like root shock and grief, is that they can be, these can be quite paralyzing politically, right? Because although it's really important to find out about what is happening to people and how they respond, if we don't go further in terms of ask the question about, okay, this is happening, then how do people mobilize? Then, maybe we're not going to get beyond that point of thinking, oh, this has happened. we know why it's happened and it's terrible, but where are we going from here? I'm not saying that Mindy Fullidove doesn't do that kind of work, but I do think that there's some of the work on displacement tends to get too much into the, what we might call the affective and not into the political. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I do think that this is important and the cyclical aspect of this is essential. And as you were talking, actually, I was thinking back to that quote I read out from the community organizer in Minneapolis saying that this is a battle that's been going on for 300 years. All right. So, you know, this is something which I think, and this is where Neil can help us again, because the analysis was acutely historical, right? You know, he begins his book with Frederick Jackson Turner, right? And Nancy mentioned this earlier, the importance of thinking historically about dispossession is so important. Thank you.
And really quickly, I was thinking about this in terms of that question about race and racialization. And so if you think about various subjects, if they're racialized at different historical moments or points, that might shift their relationship to capital, it might shift their relationship to the built environment. But over time, you have subjects occupying these different locations. And so that's where the race, class, and gender can go together, or at least can shift that particular individual, or again, that subject position in thinking about that analysis. So thank you. Yes, you did.
Thank you.
Yan Lin?
Hello. Yes, thank you so much, Tom, for such a provocative talk.
Hi, Yan.
I've learned so much from some of your writing with Loretta Lee's on gentrification and planetary gentrification. And what I wanted to ask you about is your call for cross-national collaboration around issues of both theory and practice, and your attention to Native and First Peoples struggles. I'm impressed by the idea that struggles around, say, the Zapatista in Mexico in the 90s, and then the Dakota Access Pipeline more recently has become a place for encounters, encuentros, they said, among the Zapatista between first world and third world activists. And the difficulties for these kinds of cross-national, not only in theory, you know, in the academy, but practically, how can these kinds of cross-national alliances, you know, events and idea sharing be promoted, you know, for capitalists? They've got the G7, they've got the G20. And so the only thing that I think kind of more recently, possibly Occupy Wall Street, starting in the US, and I wonder to what degree that promoted protests against financialization, really drumming up of concerns about the unhoused, and to what extent Black Lives Matter promoted similar movements in the UK. So just ideas for how cross-national networks can be promoted, not just in the academy, but the very difficult idea of promoting them in activism.
Wow, goodness me, difficult one, and I'm going to have a go. One of the things, I mean, you say not just in the academy. One of the things I think maybe we all feel, I certainly feel this as somebody in the academy, is that I do seem to spend a lot of time and energy trying to carve a space to try and do the kind of research and teaching that I want to do. And it's exhausting, but it happens. And we have to fight a lot of these battles in universities because of the way that they're run and the way that they are effectively corporations that also hand out degrees every summer. You know, these are problems which I think we all face, and we don't talk about them enough, right? So first of all, there are these battles which can be exhausting, and I think the more we support each other in those, the better, then the further we can get. We also need to try and find ways to make university spaces more amenable for these kinds of discussions, because too often they are not. And we also need to, you know, realize that what might be particularly interesting among a group of scholars and particularly pertinent in terms of theory and concepts might not be the case for people who are engaged in a struggle of some kind. And therefore, sometimes we can approach organizations and communities with a set of ideas about what we want to do without thinking, oh, actually, maybe, you know, we could do this together, right? And so these kinds of things are difficult. I'm not saying this is an easy thing to do, but there's a lot of groundwork that has to be done before they can take place. The other thing I'm going to say is that in my book, Shaking Up the City, which I mentioned, I do talk about the kind of work that tends to get resources which are so important for people engaged in housing and land justice struggles, the kinds of concepts that people use that tend to attract the kinds of money that and resources that people need to build a movement and to do important work that fights for people's land and fights for people's homes. Is not, you know, these are the sorts of concepts which I think we need to start interrogating. For example, about 10, 12 years ago, the term resilience started appearing everywhere in urban studies and well beyond. And a cottage industry of work started to become funded about, you know, doing, all asking the same kinds of questions. And not really, I mean, some of it was politically progressive, but a lot of it wasn't. And I think we need to start talking about this more, about what kind of work gets funded and what interventions we can make at the level of, you know, who sits on these funding panels, who's on these boards that decide what gets the grant. And these are discussions that we don't have very often. And I think the sooner that we do, then I think the further we will get in terms of building alliances. So that's a very rambling answer to a great question. And I wish I had more time and more energy to give a more coherent one. But thank you very much for asking it.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a reasoned response to a difficult question.
Well, thanks very much indeed. And with that, I think we should probably now thank Tom for his presentation and for everybody else for their participation.
Thanks for sticking around.
Questions. And finally, I'm going to turn it over for some closing remarks to my colleague here at UAlbany, Francisco Vieira.
Hello, everybody. I'm Francisco Vieira. I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology here at UAlbany. To close up the conference, as Tim mentioned, I just wanted to share a few very short comments. I promise I'll keep them short, as well as a few thank yous and something of an announcement. In terms of comments, if I remember correctly, it was Dr. Hyra who yesterday stated that the conference made us all students again because of the experience, the expertise, the creativity being shared. And I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. I've learned so much from everybody here and so much that will stay with me in my research and my teaching for years. To highlight just a few of these many things that have been personally impressed upon me and that I think connect many of the panels, the questions, the answers, the comments. First, through this conference, I've learned the importance of recognizing and gaining an understanding of the full variety and the range of the scale, the forms, the repercussions of gentrification. In the presentations, questions, and comments, we have seen huge global cities like New York City and Los Angeles. We've also examined cities such as Philadelphia, Chicago, DC, Oakland, Edinburgh, and Hoboken. We've even looked at small communities like Kingston, New York, Hudson, New York, and Ashbury, New Jersey. And as Dr. Slater pushed us in his keynote, we've started to consider places outside of the global north, to look to the global south. All of these, it is clear, add to the understanding of gentrification and to the advancement of gentrification studies, into the 21st century. Beyond scale, we have seen, via Dr. Macris, seasonal gentrification, and via Dr. Hyra, the many historical waves and manifestations of gentrification, whether from a production or consumption side, as well as a wide span of mechanisms and mediators, from civil society to the state, from what Dr. Shkuda called the culture and real estate industries to what Dr. Cover-Glenn called the middles. And beyond both scale and form, we've also seen gentrification's impacts above and beyond housing per se. In and of itself, we have seen via Dr. Macris and Bierbaum that to talk about gentrification is also talk about educational inequality and more general processes of social and spatial exclusion, even in what many would consider public and semi-public spaces and places. We have seen via Dr. Deering that to talk about gentrification is to also talk about state intervention via the police and courts, as well as civil society. And we have seen that talking about gentrification means not just talking about displacement, but also health, the unmooring, stress, depression, trauma so powerfully captured by Dr. Fulilov's concept of root shock, and certainly in these times of COVID-19, as we noted yesterday, physical health more broadly, and we could go on. Second, I have learned the importance of widening our lens and at times truly upending our pre-existing concepts, frames, and foci when examining gentrification. Dr. Summers eloquently reminded us, as did Drs. Boston, Dinsey Flores, and Mita Ball in different ways, that we need to consider gentrification as not only or even primarily the story of the often high income, high wealth white gentrifiers, but instead by the marginalized communities that are impacted by it. That is, we need to listen to and center the Black and other communities of color, the working class and poor communities, and the other minoritized and stigmatized communities, such as the LGBT community, and as Dr. Slater pushed us, right, gender minorities whose worlds, material, social, cultural, emotional, are all upended and twisted by gentrification. At the same time, however, we learned also the importance of what Dr. Summers calls Black joy, above or despite gentrification. That is the importance of underscoring, and I emphasize this as a sociologist, a discipline that's really, really bad at this, the importance of emphasizing what Kevin Quashie eloquently calls Black aliveness, right? Or Black being and living beyond and above anti-Blackness. Catherine McKittrick puts this in a very helpful way as well, and calling for a mathematics or a description of Blackness that goes beyond violence, beyond social and physical death. There are always multiple sides to any gentrification story, but the human side, right, those people who are impacted by it, is never one to forget or to ignore. Third, I have learned from the example of the conference itself and from all of you the importance of what I'll call cross-cutting and interconnecting work. I mean by that the importance of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, non-disciplinary work. In this conference, we saw research arising from education, history, geography, anthropology, American studies, political science, sociology, many others. I also mean by that methods. We saw the full range, right, from close-up, immersive, ethnographic work to detailed narrative history to more big picture, definitional, and theoretical work, each of which adds an essential piece to the puzzle of understanding gentrification and pushing forward gentrification studies. And I also mean, and I really want to stress this, the importance of breaking out of the ivory tower, right, as we have seen via Rebecca Gerard, Dr. Holmes, Dr. Lin, and especially in our wonderful keynote by Dr. Slater, the importance of listening to, of learning from, of working with the community activists, as well as those in the NGO, the nonprofit world, who are all on the front lines of, you know, these urban frontiers, so to speak. I could go on forever, I really, really could, but I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'm going to move on to the thank yous and an announcement at the end that I hope we can all participate in. First, thank you to my co-organizers, Doctors Johanna Londonio, Zawadi Ruxahidiana, and Timothy Weaver, all here at SUNY Albany. I especially want to thank Dr. Londonio. It was Dr. Londonio's vision that commenced our work on this conference. It was her unwavering focus and persistence that pushed this conference from a vague idea to a tangible reality. Without her, the conference really would not have happened. Thank you to the Albany College of Arts and Sciences, Dean's Office, and the Faculty Research Awards Program provided us the funding that made this conference possible. Thanks to, of course, the Departments of Latin American, Caribbean, and US Latino Studies, Sociology, and Political Science. Thank you to Michelle Bruck of the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office, and Latoya Tate and Victor C. of Internet Technology Services for helping us on the technical end of holding this conference. A million thank yous to our wonderful panelists and discussants. It's clear, right, that the leading edge of gentrification studies is here in this room, these Zoom boxes, if you will. Another million thanks to our keynote speaker, Dr. Slater, for his wonderful insight into Neil Smith and to the new urban frontiers and gentrification, and to really pushing us to to embracing and using the new urban frontiers in new and exciting ways. And last, certainly, but not least, thanks to everyone attending this conference, right, for viewing, for adding your questions or commentary. It's truly appreciated, especially during the summer, right? I know everybody has many other things to do. But I hope with all of that, this conference has the same lasting impact on you that it has had on me, will have on me. In fact, I hope that the conference can live on in a couple of different ways. Zawadi joked yesterday about who is going to take the reins on planning and holding next year's version of this conference. I think I can speak for the other organizers in saying that we would be more than happy if this conference became an annual or at least a regular event. Perhaps this could be the beginning of some network, an active network of gentrification scholars and scholarship. We're certainly open to that. Please let us know. Also, when we started planning the conference, we threw around the idea of turning the conference into an edited collection, an edited volume. After hearing all of these amazing presentations, as well as the passionate, the fruitful discussions that they generated, I'm all the more certain that this needs to happen. To do this, of course, requires so many beyond us co-organizers. So consider this an announcement, an invitation to contribute to an edited volume. Panelists, again, the presentations were amazing. We'd love to see them as chapters. I know that there are many great urban scholars in the audience as well, each of whom is also more than welcome to contribute. So with all that, I want to open the metaphorical mic open to everyone and ask if any of you have additional ideas, suggestions, dreams, hopes, desires on what the next steps can be following this conference. Where do we go from here to make sure that this wonderful work continues? If not, the other co-organizers and I are always reachable via email. We hope to see this conference live on.
Can you guys hear me? Can I make a comment? Is the mic on? I just want to say thank you to everybody for all of you that organized and put in the hard work. I know what organizing, I know what organizing is for affordable housing, but there's also organizing for putting on a conference like this, and it's a lot of work. So I just want to thank you for all of that. And I personally would say I'd love to figure out a way to keep this going. I think Maya and Zawadi were tweeting about my center MPC maybe doing something like this. I don't know if we're able to do this, or maybe we're able to collaborate with you guys at Albany to keep something like this going, maybe once a year, once every 2 years. But I mean, I just got so much out of this. I'm sure that's just my feelings. I can tell that's the feelings of a lot of people who participated in this conference. So, figuring out a way to combine some funding and some logistical power to keep this conversation going on around the world would be fantastic. But I just don't exactly know what that is. But I'd be happy to think about it as the summer moves on. So again, thank you.
I don't know if Johanna, Tim, Zawadi, if you guys had anything else to add.
I mean, I don't have anything else to add, really. Francisco, you put it so nicely. I just want to thank everyone again for helping make this possible. It was such an invigorating and just really thought-provoking 2 days, and I'm excited for continuing the conversation, either in another conference or just casually over drinks, which many of us have talked about, right, over the last 2 days. So thank you again. And we will work on posting these recordings. So we'll keep you all updated once we figure out that piece of puzzle.
Well, I think with that, we should officially say goodbye. Thank you. See you all again soon.